Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavors of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. We've got another special episode this week. Good to chat again, Zack.
Yeah, likewise, Matthew.
All right. Hey, well, it's always great to have these component episodes. And as I always say, don't be put off by that, because this is just as much valuable content in here as when we talk to designers about specific projects. And there's some great learning and a really great story in this as well. And in fact, there is a designer as part of this conversation as well, which I think is fantastic, because it just really highlights that it's not just about a product, but it's about a process, and it's about the people as well. So give us a bit of background into who we're talking with.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking with Chris Benedict, who's the principal at Chris Benedict Architect, and she's a pioneer of passive house work. She's been,
should be a familiar name to a lot of listeners, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And she's laid the foundation for all sorts of wonderful passive house work in New York, both by her firm as well as the broader community, and has played a really important role in policy development in New York that's paved the way for a bunch of exciting stuff. So Chris is joined by Zack Semke, who's product manager at Sto Corp. And so this is an example of a leading practitioner talking about her work and innovations and the role of a leading product to help make that happen. So it's a really fun look into where the rubber meets the road in terms of innovation and accelerating passive house. So I hope you'll enjoy it. Well, welcome Chris Benedict and Zack Semke to this special Passive House component podcast episode. It's really great to have you both here to chat with me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Definitely. Chris Benedict is a pioneer of passive house architecture and design, and mover and shaker in New York and beyond in that space. Zack Semke is a leader and mover and shaker at Sto Corp, which is a key provider of passive house components and materials. So it's really exciting to have this confluence of a practitioner and a manufacturer here to have this conversation. So that there's really brief introductions for the two of you, but I'd love for, and I think a lot of our audience is aware of the work that you both do already. But for those who aren't, Chris, could you start by introducing yourself a bit?
Well, sure. Well, thanks for having me first on Passive House Accelerator. It's really a great organization, and I'm so happy you guys exist. So I'm Chris Benedict. I'm an architect. I have an office in New York City. I started my career as in my own office in 1995, and I had a mission to make environmentally sound buildings. But at that time, I really didn't know what it was. And I spent a lot of years chasing after building scientists and learning building science, and going into boiler rooms and actually helping my partner, Henry Gifford, build boilers, and got a great hands-on experience and learned pretty soon on, making something environmentally sound has very much to do with energy, and the energy gets used down in the boiler room. Right. So we created a number of buildings. First, we did substantial gut rehabs using something that at the time I called the system approach. And then we translated that into multifamily buildings in New York City. And we were one of the very early people to take the building science that people were carrying out in single family into multifamily. We got really great results by doing things in a smart way, but code minimum. So that was our game at the time, was how good could we make a building code minimum, but following good building science rules. We got a lot of recognition for it. And then some people started to say to me, well, there's these buildings in Europe that don't even have boilers. And I thought, well, how could that be? And started to learn about Passive House and saw that it was what we were doing, but in a much more highly regimented way, with software that helped you figure out what the priorities could be. So I immediately jumped on that and was able to have a client who wanted to do it. And since then have been, really a strong advocate of the Passive House protocol, and hopefully really changed the way New York City thinks about making environmentally sound multifamily buildings.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we'll have a chance to dive into that a little bit more in this conversation. So, Zack, tell us about your role at Sto Corp and also what Sto Corp wants to see for the Passive House movement here in North America.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us, Zack. Really appreciate it, and it's really great to do this thing with Chris too. She's just such a great advocate for our systems, and they work, and she's just a great advocate for all that. So my official title is product manager for facade restoration, and I started with Sto about 3.5 years ago now. And when I started with Sto, we had some people, more specifically our construction design manager out of New York, Dan Canova, who said, Zack, there is going to be a huge market for deep energy retrofits in the state of New York and elsewhere, but that the state of New York is really leading the way. So I said, okay, great. So I started digging into it. What's happening in New York? Who are the players? What are the policies looking like? Things like that. So when I started, with Sto, my official title is product manager. So you would think, okay, he manages products, right? He's thinking about the marketing, the promotion, the place, all that good stuff that comes with marketing and product management and product development. But when it comes to deep energy retrofit, Passive House kept coming up, and it's such an amazing standard in the sense that it's just so focused on performance. It really tries to not get into the weeds on the how. It's more like, what do you need? What do you need your building to do for you? For the occupants, and that's what you guys are really focused on. That's what's really attracted me to Passive House and connecting that with deep energy retrofits, and that just being so critical. So with when it comes to with Passive House and what I'd like to see for it in North America, I mean, in short, it's more. I'd love to see more. Right. It's an excellent, like I said, it's an excellent standard that really just really focuses on the performance and the outcomes for occupants. And at Sto, our tagline is building with conscience, which means there's a planetary element to that, but I think in my personal opinion, more importantly, there's a human element. So whatever we do, it ought to have a pretty substantial human benefit element with whatever we offer.
Awesome. Listening to both of you speak and share about kind of your motivations and Passive House, there's clearly like this way that their ideals and practice are harmonized here. So let's dive into the specific example or a specific example of that, and how that's being manifest in the world, and that's the Casa Pasiva project. And so I'm hoping, Chris, maybe you could start by sharing with us what the key priorities are for the project, and maybe some of the challenges, and how did the products that Sto provides, how have those played into addressing those challenges? Tell us the story.
Well, in this office, we kind of set out to do the hardest, most challenging thing that you can think of. And at the time, which was quite a few years back now, it was, well, how could we bring passive house standard to existing buildings with tenants in place? Right. Let's try that on and see how that goes. So I had already had a great experience with Sto products at 803 Knickerbocker, which was a new construction. For that, we were able to put a substantial amount of insulation on the outside of a building. But at first we had to kind of become permitted to do it. It was an affordable housing job. It was partially funded by the city of New York, but the state was also involved. And there were a lot of people who didn't really like the EIFS product and were basically forbidding us from using it. So we had reps from Sto, Dan Canova, and others come and meet with the state to talk with them about it. I figured out a way to do something very sculptural with the design so that it's really become kind of iconic in a way with the sculptural facade that we did with the Sto EIFS. What it did, and I don't want to talk too much about 803 Knickerbocker because I've talked about it a lot, but we were able to trade off the economy of the EIFS and use that money for air sealing and to pay for better windows. And we made these trade-offs and we brought that job in for the same price as typical construction because it had been designed with brick. And this is really what set the stage for moving forward, I think, with the city and passive house and this level of energy efficiency was that we really proved it could be done for the same cost if you were really smart about the trade-offs. So I love the EIFS product because it's very sculptural. You can do a lot of things with it. It's 100% insulation. It's economical. It's just capturing air on the outside of a building in the place where you want the insulation to be, the most important place, which is on the outside of the building. So then fast forward to Casa Pasiva. I had been asked by another client if I could insulate on the outside of a building. And I said, I'm sorry, it's illegal. We can't do it because at the time the zoning was saying that you weren't allowed to add more bulk to a building because it counted as floor area. So a while back during Mayor Bloomberg's time as mayor, he put together something called the Mayor's Task Force for Greening the Code and asked everyone who was involved in energy, like, what kind of measures do you want to see? And I said, well, we really need to make it so that you can insulate existing buildings on the outside and not be penalized for adding floor area. And we were able to get that through. And so that kind of set the stage for being able to even do this work and do the recladding work. That happened quite a few years ago now. So when it came to Casa Pasiva, I knew now we could insulate on the outside. It was very successful. It kind of changed the brand of the building. It changed the look of the building. It really, uplifted some of these existing buildings, but also we could install mechanical systems on the outside of the building and hide it under this cladding. And so Casa Pasiva became putting together this idea of exterior mechanical work where basically our boiler room became the roof where all of our equipment is, with mechanical systems running down the sides and then being clad with the EIFS product from Sto. The idea here was that we would spend very minimal amounts of time inside of people's apartments, and we could get a bulk of the work done on the outside. If there were tenants that wouldn't let us into the apartments, we could potentially move past them and still get, the product to come out the other end. And to a pretty much extent, that is what has happened. I mean, we've learned an awful lot since we started this. And also the Casa Pasiva project also included interior apartment renovation. So it ended up being a lot more time inside the apartments than my initial conception was for this. If we were to go to a building now and we weren't doing the interior renovation, I think that we could pretty successfully in a few days be in an apartment and out again with all the rest of the work going on the outside.
Wow, it's an inspiring story. First of all, so starting from that code innovation that is making all this kind of renaissance of retrofits possible. I mean, that's like so critical to then the notion that you're integrating the thermal barrier and the mechanical systems and everything in that space that you helped like stake out with
Right.
New York is pretty fantastic. Let's just, and maybe Zack, you can help with this, but or Chris, either of you is. I know many of the listeners know what EIFS is, but for those who don't, what are the basics? Like what is EIFS?
Sure, I could take that, Chris. So if you, a lot of people, it's funny because speaking to a lot of people at Passive House Conference and the like, some people refer to EIFS as like a base coat mesh and finish, and that's it. Our standard Sto Therm CI system, which is our classic EIFS system, it starts with the liquid applied air and moisture barrier. So we have a liquid applied, if you were to think it in terms of Casa Pasiva, right, an existing masonry building, you would go liquid apply air and moisture barrier, right? On top of that, then you would glue your insulation board, your rigid insulation board, and you would have vertical ribbons of adhesive, or I should say adhesive instead of glue, right? But vertical ribbons of adhesive to place that rigid insulation. And what that does, those vertical ribbons actually keeps the insulation off of the wall approximately an 1/8 inch or more. And what that does is allow a drainage plane. So any insulated or any incidental moisture or condensate, it can actually, gravity can allow that liquid water to fall to the bottom and drain away from the building. And then on top of that rigid insulation board, then you go ahead and, I'm going to use a New York term here. You're going to smear base coat on it, right? And then you're going to put embed your mesh into that base coat, and that's going to give you a durable, hard surface to then apply your finish. And that finish can be a standard finish. It can be something like we've just launched our new StoCast product, so you can have the look of authentic brick and wood. You can do something like what Chris did with Knickerbocker and with Casa Pasiva, which is machine the rigid insulation foam to give you tons of depth, where you can actually make these shapes whatever you want, really, and create really cool geometric patterns. So that's the basics. You have your air and moisture barrier, right? And that's your vapor, water, and air control layer. Your drainage plane, your thermal, your insulation, and then your water shedding and durability layer. And that also provides the aesthetic. And that's really it. So outbound of sheathing or an existing, like in the case of Casa Pasiva, an existing masonry building, from that liquid applied air and moisture barrier out is that system. So that's the basic EIFS for you.
And I really can't stress enough, like, what a great product it is, because it's 100% insulation and no mechanical fastenings. And these are two things that if you're going to go to a panel system, you end up having to have. You end up taking up some of those inches that you're allowed to have with structure. And then you also have a long-term maintenance item with the mechanical fastenings, which you don't have with just doing the straight EIFS. It's just such a great way to do an exterior installation on a building.
So you mentioned, Chris, the Knickerbocker project and the fact that you were able to do smart, kind of offsets and trade-offs and things to bring the project in at essentially the same cost as conventional construction. Now, evaluating a retrofit is more complicated because it's hard to know what exactly is the baseline. Like if you talk about what a conventional retrofit is versus a passive house retrofit, are you seeing what's the cost story for a project like Casa Pasiva from your perspective?
Well, there was definitely this was not done for the same price as typical construction because there really isn't something to measure it against.
Yeah.
It's a funny hybrid between a substantial gut and new construction.
Right.
It kind of is inside there. So it really, for Riseborough, who is the client on this, they're very mission oriented, and they found a way to finance it. And I believe that it was $140,000 per unit to do this. Now, it came at a time where a reassessment of the financing was being done anyway. And they call it year 15 here in New York. And so there was money available to do a rehab. Now, my dream was, let's take the money that normally would be spent and do, passive house with it. It turned out that it was more expensive than that. There's good times to contemplate this. One of them is if you have a building that's tall enough that it requires to have something called local law 11 inspections for the facades. If your facade is in not that great shape, you may want to spend your money on freezing it in time and recladding. If your mechanical systems are ready to give it up, you may want to take that money instead and switch it over to ductless split heating and cooling and a new ventilation system. So there are different points in a building's life where it would be more economical to do it than other times. But of course, now, times they are changing. And we in the passive house world have talked about where things are going, and where they're going right now seems to be incredibly high energy costs. And so, this whole thing about, being a landlord like Riseborough is, and, trying to maintain some kind of tenant comfort in any kind of affordable level. It's now it's really showing itself as being, a good thing for us to be doing, citywide.
And you mentioned Riseborough a couple of times just now, and so I'm glad you did. And we just had the privilege of interviewing Ryan Cassidy of Riseborough a couple of weeks ago. So I think the timing is good. Obviously Riseborough is a key player in all of this. This is their project. So what has that experience been like? What has it been like working with Riseborough so far?
I have always received a massive amount of support from Riseborough. They, as I said, are very mission oriented. They really want to, be the innovators, the pioneers for this type of thing going on in New York City. And they really have been. They've figured out how to finance it for the tenant in place rehab. They've figured out how to do the tenant piece of it. I'm doing the technical parts, but we have the tenant part as well. And they have just excelled in figuring out what direction to go in, and then how to manage it and finance it.
What about the future of building retrofits in New York, based on where you're sitting and what you've seen this go from? Basically, retrofits are impossible because the rules disallow these adjustments to the building envelope, to now engineering the solution where, there's always been this conversation about, well, we really should think about the thermal envelope as being almost part of the HVAC system, right? Like we need to rethink that. And here you have it literally made the thermal envelope and the HVAC system integrated. So from that place of at that cutting edge of innovation in the space, what's the future, you think?
Well, I know that at least for my office coming down the line are quite a few more buildings that we're going to be doing this with. I mean, I hope to keep doing this for as long as I can be doing it. I think that as we move along, we're going to be innovating different things to facilitate it. But I don't think that we really made any major boo-boos in how we're doing it right now. Mm-hmm. But, improvements can always be made. I mean, one thing that actually has been fascinating is learning tenant priorities. So one thing that we have just discovered that is just so interesting is how do we get tenants who may or may not want to open up their doors to welcome us in? And it seems to be bring them really great air conditioning.
I'd open my door for that.
And so, we're starting this has been a 2-phase job. So on phase 2, the first knock on the door is going to be a day where we come in and we set up the ductless splits and the insides of the ventilation system and get that all ready. And it's already, the work outside is done. And so like 2 to 3 days later, they have air conditioning. And that's the first time they see us and they get that. And then after that, hopefully we're welcome back in to be able to do the rest of the apartment renovation. But this way, that can happen at its own cycle. And then other stuff can happen in its own timing. And so we're just so many things like this that we're just starting to learn about how to go about doing this that aren't necessarily like technological things. They're more like whole system things that includes the people.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, that's smart, because we tend to be very, especially in organizations and communities like this one, we tend to be so focused on the technical that you just don't think about those little things. You don't think about the person who's actually living there, who may or may not trust anyone. And there's people knocking, telling them, and it might be people that have just been let down by other people, by landlord, whoever. So to come in there and be able to not bother them for a long time. And then when you do, you're giving them something and they see it quickly. That's smart.
Yeah.
And Zack, you mentioned Dan predicting this retrofit boom. And of course, we have Local Law 97 in New York City that's going to be driving a lot of energy improvements to buildings because of the emissions caps and things. For Sto Corp, what are you gearing up for? And what are you kind of expecting to see with building retrofits in New York? And how are you responding?
Sure. So Dan is somebody who I have great respect for. He's been in the industry for decades, and he's been based in New York, so he knows the market really well. So when he makes a prediction like that, it's not something I would take lightly. I would take very seriously, and I did, and it shows. He's absolutely right. Everything he ever told me is coming to fruition. So when it comes to what the market is looking like and what the future holds for us, I'll start with the present. The reason I say that is because, we're really lucky to already have a system that we've been manufacturing and technically supporting for years, that is just really such a perfect fit for what they need to do with these buildings. And the fights that are sort of happening on the floors of municipalities, like the thing that Chris just mentioned about being able to add to the exterior without counting it as floor space. Those little fights, or those little victories, is great. So we're really fortunate to already be in a really good position, right? You think about 2 of the 5 passive house principles being continuous insulation and airtight envelope. You look at our Sto Therm CI system and you go, duh. This is what you need. So really fortunate. But at the same time, we understand that a lot of energy, and, forgive the pun, people's energy that is being put towards this thing, we understand that it needs better stuff too. So we can't just sit idle. We always have to be innovating, but of course, keeping in mind those human benefits that are needed and the building science principles that need to remain intact. So it's not about innovating something because it sounds cool or because it has a trendy name. You got to keep those benefits in mind. The building science, the wall science, that moisture control is key. The minimizing the thermal bridging, the not messing with things when you don't need to. So that holy grail, or that that next big innovation wall system, we always have our fingers on the pulse with that. What does that holy grail look like? Is it something that is prefabricated? Okay, if it's prefabricated, how can we do this without penetrating the existing envelope? How can we do it while still maintaining those costs, that we can actually do these things and people like Riseborough can actually still finance it, and they don't have to rely on subsidies and things like that, for the long run. So we're really thinking holistically about it and what the best path is forward. But I do believe that the next decade is going to see a ton of failure. And I say that because it's going to see a ton of innovation. And innovation is fraught with failure. That's just the nature of it. And we will fail a lot. And a lot of other companies will do the same. So I think you're going to see a lot of really cool failures in the next decade. And if you've heard me talk about this stuff before, you've probably heard me say, I think it's more about the how than the what. I think the materials, the stuff we use today, we can do it. We can meet these goals. We can retrofit these buildings. We can do it with the stuff we got. The how is so much more important. It's how can we do it in the most efficient way possible? How can we, as Sto, provide better products? How can we provide better service? How can we make it so, where can we innovate in the software space, in the manufacturing space, where we can actually take an existing building and really design that thing through manufacturing and installation, sort of a cradle to cradle process. How can we do things in the most efficient way possible? So, again, you're going to see a lot of failures in the next decade, which is going to be great, which is going to be cool because that's how you innovate. But I think you're going to see some big innovation in the how it's done.
Chris, I think a little bit about the how, right? I mean, you were just speaking to the human element of delivery and things, but stepping back and thinking about the work of your firm, and I think you've alluded to this a little bit, but I'd love to hear you expand on it. What do you see on the horizon for your work?
Well, right now we're working on a really interesting modular building. And that one will also, it's a 13-story building where we'll be using EIFS and doing a faux brick on the building. So
wow.
It was very important to the owner, Blue Sea Development, that it blend in with the neighborhood and look like the older buildings. And at the same time, have it be a passive house. So, we're going to be doing, a faux brick finish on this building. And so far it looks like it's going to look amazing. And so, I think my stance has always been, let's do what's appropriate. Let's bring the appropriate technologies to the table for any specific project. And in this case, since there are many repeatable elements in the building, the modular construction makes a gigantic amount of sense. Mm. And this is versus the buildings that I'm working on right now for Casa Pasiva, where, the buildings have lots of ins and outs. And like there's one building with courtyards and air shafts, and it has 15 facades on it. It's not really the building that we're going to be bringing panels to. It's covered with fire escapes. And so in any case, moving forward with the modular stuff, I'm learning things from that to bring back into the rehab space. I mean, that's the nice thing about working on different kinds of jobs, is starting to blend, one approach that makes sense somewhere else and bring it to a place where people haven't seen it or done it before. So, for me, it's like, I just love inventing and grabbing the most difficult stuff and trying to figure out how to do it. And fortunately for me, I've had clients who will, hire me to do that. So
right.
I hope that continues.
Yeah. That whole thing of trying on the most difficult things is it's sort of like that could be, maybe that's perhaps the core value of the Passive House movement.
Yes. Yes. I tell you, some of my first tours of Passive House, after having done some of my own work and then going into these other, I have cried. I have wept on some of these tours because I'm so moved by what people are doing as they just throw themselves at these jobs and figure it out and get it done. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah. I think that gets back to, I think a little bit to Zach, to what you're talking about around innovation and the risk of failure. There's a kind of a courage that this work entails. And that is really can be moving.
Yeah.
Well, this has really been so fantastic. Thank you both for your time and sharing your insights now. And Zach, also thank you to Sto Corp. I failed to mention this at the top of our conversation, but a big thank you to Sto Corp for being a founding sponsor of Passive House Accelerator and supporting our work and our programming. It really has made a huge difference. So we appreciate that.
It's absolutely our pleasure. We believe in the work you guys are doing, and we think you guys are doing a great job. And no thank you necessary, Zach. Our sponsor shout out. The podcast is thank you enough.
Well, yeah. That's awesome. Very gracious. So, what is there anything else that either of you would like to add before we wrap up?
I would just like to say one more time, Chris, thank you so much, for coming on here and doing this and talking about this project. We're so excited about this project and the way it's going. We actually are planning, I don't know if I should say this or not because we haven't done it yet, but we're planning on doing some kind of video component for this project, some kind of spotlight, some kind of video case study, if you will, on this. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be really great. And Chris is just such an awesome architect to work with. Sorry, I'm going to make you blush a little bit, Chris, but it's so cool when you get to work with a unique mind like hers, where she's strong on the creative side and she's strong on the science and technical and analytical side. And it's she's just somebody that gets it. And thanks, Chris. Appreciate you. Zach, I promise, and everybody who's listening, I promise we're not paying her anything to my knowledge. She's just such a great advocate for our stuff. Thank you. That's all.
Hey, may we continue to make beautiful buildings together.
Well
You're
said.
here. Please
Well
do,
said.
guys. Appreciate it. All right. Well, a big thank you, and please be well, both of you.
Thanks
for having us.
And that was Sto Corp talking also with designer Chris Benedict, who a lot of people will be familiar with if you've listened to the Accelerator for a while and checked out some videos. Really cool stories in there, Zach, and just totally emphasizes the quality of, I even hesitate to call them sponsors because there's so much more than that, supporters of the Accelerator and what we do. And it's so much about the process of what they do. I really like what he said. It's about the how, not the what. We've got the what. We just need to figure out how to get more of it out there and onto buildings. And there are some great examples of overcoming some of the challenges involved with that. I can relate to the kind of nonsense of putting external insulation on a building and that affecting the floor area,
right,
or the building footprint. I kind of get it, but I love the fact that they found a solution around that and just said, look, let's overcome this barrier because it's fairly unnecessary, and get on with the job of adding a really good solution to retrofit existing buildings.
Yeah, at the beginning of the conversation, Chris shared that when she first got involved in sustainable architecture, she quickly realized that energy is where it's at. And when you think about where energy is being consumed in a building, it's in the boiler room. So the action is in the boiler room. And then she talked about how her work with Passive House has kind of moved that, kind of moving the boiler room up to the roof, right? And now she's then carved out this space in New York for the envelope, these thicker thermal envelopes to be possible, and these retrofits to be possible. And then the mechanical systems are getting integrated into the thermal envelope. So it's just a really cool evolution that she's described. And the envelope has become so important. As we know in Passive House, it's all about the envelope, but she's taking that to a new level, which is really cool.
Well, and like a lot of people who have been in the industry for a while, it's an evolution to get to that point. And she's started out trying to work out how to do better boilers, and then eventually realized that people don't want better boilers. They want to be warm, dry, and efficient and comfortable in their homes. And if you can do that with better insulation, then that's a much better focus to produce that outcome rather than just trying to produce a better boiler all the time. Yeah, it's very similar to the old anecdote of Henry Ford saying people don't want faster horses.
Right.
And it's a matter of figuring out what the end goal is and coming up with a totally better way of doing that.
And that's and I mean, sorry to interrupt, but that right there is figuring out a better way to do that is where the manufacturers become so important. And I think that's why these conversations, these component spotlights are, I think, so interesting, and people enjoy them so much, or these component podcast episodes, because these are the products and components that make this stuff possible. And so the reason that she was able to integrate the mechanical system into the thermal envelope in the way that she's done is that she's got this malleable insulation product that Sto Corp is providing. So I find that where the nexus there to be so interesting.
Just on that, are there some images or some resources people can see what we're talking about there? Because for people that haven't seen the Passive House live, and I recommend going and checking that out. Where's the best place for people to have a look at what that is?
Well, I will include links in the show notes to Sto Corp's website, but they have a bunch of cool images of how EIFS works and what it looks like, and different examples. I mean, the exteriors of the buildings can really look like, and there's a tremendous amount of design flexibility. But Zack went through the layers that are involved, and there's a great infographic that shows that as well that we'll share.
Cool. Yeah. The other thing that Chris brought up, and it was so great to have her on the call, is talking about the people and the reality of one of the biggest challenges of doing deep retrofits with people in place is realizing that you're dealing with people, it's people's homes for a start, and the people who are living in that building aren't necessarily, they're not going to be part of the design team. They're not going to be part of the decision-making process, and it's going to feel like they're having stuff done to them.
Yeah, kind of imposed on them. Yeah.
And I think that's, especially as engineers and architects, we don't always think about that. I mean, we think about it if you're working with a client and they're heavily involved in all the decision-making process. But in this situation, you're impacting people's lives who are not engaged in that process. And I thought that was just an amazing insight and such a great idea to come up with a way that, as much as possible, the first interaction they have with you is something really positive. And in that case, it was, hey, we're here to install an air conditioning unit. And they're going to see almost an instant result from that, rather than, hey, in 3 weeks' time, we're going to turn up, there's going to be lots of noise and the lifts probably won't work for a few days. And that's just going to go downhill.
Right. And we have this opportunity if we're smart, as Chris has demonstrated, if we're smart, because we're making these buildings better when they're retrofitted, to lead with the benefit. And so it makes a lot of sense. Good reminder of the human element in all of this, of course.
So really great stuff. Do you check out all the great stuff, Sto Corp, and we'll put some links up in those show notes. We've talked about this before, about the value of integrated systems that do Passive House so well. I mean, that's one of the great things about these products, is that they help with so many of the performance components and the requirements of a passive house, particularly that continuous external insulation, but also looking after some of the weather tightness and the air and vapor control. To be able to do that, all within a system is really beneficial. And it leaves a lot of that creativity, puts it back in the hands of the architect and the designer, whether they're building new or doing some of these really necessary and exciting retrofits. So some really great stuff there.
Indeed. Check out Sto Corp at Sto Corp, so STOCORP.com.
Awesome.
Thanks, Matthew.